Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hey, I'm delighted to welcome back to the show the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt.
Good morning, Robert.
Lovely to see you. Sunday Times making big play of what they say is a big push for you in July. They think you're going to be able to announce $4 billion a year of extra NHS spending then. Is that real?
I think it's premature to be having that kind of speculation right now. I mean, there's no doubt that NHS staff right now are working unbelievably hard and they need to have some hope for the future. But I think their real concern is this rather crazy way that we've been funding the NHS over the last 20 years, which has basically been feast or famine. So you can look at periods where it's been 6% rises annually, huge amounts of money wasted on IT projects, PFIs, contract deals with doctors that haven't worked out well.
So you think a bit more certainty?
And then following the recession, for completely understandable reasons, we then had a period where the budget went up by 0.1%, which created enormous pressure. And we have got this totally unique situation in the history of the NHS with the ageing population. So in 10 years' time, in this country, we will have 1 million more over 75s. And the question is, do we want to approach that challenge in a strategic way, where we move beyond this feast or famine and look at it in a structured way? And I think if we do that, we will get a much better deal for taxpayers and be much fairer to staff on the NHS. And I think that's the big call we have to make.
So can I just, therefore, drill down a bit on this? We've got a comprehensive spending review coming up, which will set the framework for ministerial budgets for 3 years, but would you like to see even longer-term certainty for health spending?
Well, I have said before that I think it should be a 10-year settlement, but that isn't government policy. But obviously these are discussions.
Are you still arguing for that?
That we have. Well, I think, you know, given that it takes 7 years to train a doctor and 3 years to train a nurse, you need to have something that gives you the ability to look ahead and say, you know, if as I want, and I know the Prime Minister is passionate about, every single older person is going to be treated with the highest standards of dignity, respect and really high quality healthcare, then exactly how many doctors are we going to need? How many nurses are we going to need? And to be able to plan for that in a structured way does take you beyond the normal spending review periods.
And can I just ask, where do you think the Prime Minister is on the 10-year plan?
I mean, look, I've said this is my personal view, but what I will say is that if you look at this Prime Minister, she has been the Prime Minister, the only Prime Minister who has talked about the need to really solve the problems in social care. One of her first very big decisions was to increase the number of doctors and nurses that we train by 25%. Nearly every single one of her budgets have prioritised either the NHS or the social care system. So this is someone who is as determined to be bold and decisive in social policy as she has been internationally, as we've seen in the last few weeks.
Now, you personally have not ruled out the idea of a special earmark tax, what people call a hypothecated tax for the NHS. Do you think that will happen?
Well, I think, again, it's a bit premature to talk about that. If you ask the public about the NHS, they're very clear. They would like to see more money going to the NHS. They would be prepared to see some of their own taxes going into the NHS. But they are very clear. They want to know that money is actually going into the NHS and social care system, and they want to know that the NHS is going to reform and tackle some of the inefficiencies.
So it sounds as though you're quite attracted to the idea of a badged bit of tax being the NHS. Nick Bowles has said national insurance should be renamed, I think, the sort of national health insurance tax. Do you like that idea?
Well, we are a taxpayer-funded system. So in the end, if we're going to get more resources into the NHS and social care system, it will have to come through the tax system and also through growth in the economy. But what I would say is if you have a longer-term settlement, You could, for example, negotiate deals with drugs companies for better prices for the most innovative drugs on the basis of certainty of uptake in the NHS. You could put IT systems into hospitals that made nurses a lot more productive, so they're not always having to write down everything on scraps of paper. So there's a lot of things that you could do that would fundamentally improve the efficiency of the system. And what the public want to know is, yeah, I understand the case that the NHS needs more money. I'd like to see that money going in, but I want to know that every pound is being spent wisely.
Some people will pick up on what you've said, and they will notice that you're not claiming that when we leave the European Union, there is going to be this big pot of money which Boris Johnson and Michael Gove promised would be there. You are saying if we are going to get more money into the health service, it's got to come from higher taxes.
Well, I think the truth is that it's too early to say that because we don't know what the outcome of the Brexit talks are. And I'm very hopeful because of the superb achievement of Theresa May in nailing the transition period this week, that we will have a very smooth Brexit and the economy will continue to grow. And then that would, of course, mean... That's a bigger debate, but that would mean more money was available. And that would be great for the NHS if that was possible.
I noticed you say quite a lot of ifs. There are quite a lot of ifs there. But if I could just talk to you about your midwives announcement. So you are going to announce, I think in a matter of, what is it, Tuesday I think you're announcing this, that expectant mothers will be able to have the same midwife all the way through, or the same team? The
same team of midwives.
But can I just ask you one question about that? So when, you know, I had my kid, it was just taken for granted you had the same midwife all the way through. What went wrong? Well,
some parts of the NHS are already doing this, but, you know, we have to understand one of the worst things that can happen to anyone is to lose a child. My whole time as Health Secretary has actually been shaped by some incredibly brave individuals who've lost their children and campaigned on it. And we know we need to make maternity care safer. And we know one of the things that makes a really big difference to relaxing mums, reassuring mums through the pregnancy process, particularly for that first child, is if they meet the midwife or the team of midwives...
But do you regret doing this? I mean, you're any minute now you're going to be the longest-serving Health Secretary, I think, ever. Do you regret coming to this late in the, you know, relatively late in your term of office?
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of things that we've already done to improve maternity safety. But in the end, if we're going to have this, what we call the continuity of carer, the same team of midwives, we think that could potentially save 700 babies' lives every year, potentially prevent 500 babies being born with brain damage. But it needs more midwives. And one of the things this Prime Minister has done is thought about the NHS workforce issues. Do we have enough doctors, enough nurses, enough midwives? This is a 25% increase in the number of midwives we train.
I mean, some have said that if you hadn't abolished the bursary system, you'd already have those extra midwives, and you're sort of basically reversing cuts that you yourselves imposed.
Well, the bursary system is a very recent change. And the reason we did that was precisely to be able to afford to increase the number of nurses we train by a quarter. And we need to watch that carefully, but there are other ways that we can attract people into nursing which won't involve incurring high fees, and I hope that will make up for that difference.
Lots more to talk to you about in just a couple of minutes. I asked the Health Secretary to be reshuffled to another TV programme, but he refused, and he's still with me. But first, Allegra.
So some reaction out there. Stephen Hawkes from The Sun being very effusive about... Hold on, where's it go? Right, there it is. Hold on, if I can just get it up. There we are. Stephen Hawkes saying, Jeremy Hunt, impressive on Peston. Question, does he back a Royal Commission into future funding? Maybe you can ask Jeremy Hunt that in a second. But this week, our guest announced an incredibly generous pay rise for people who aren't doctors and dentists. So that's... What looked like. Indeed, Robert, if you will let me get on to the bulk of this. So let's have a look at what these pay rises look like in detail. So we've got this nurse, and she is earning at the moment over £23,000, and her new pay under Jeremy Hunt's generous deal goes up to £27,416. Headline pay rise of 16%. Wowee, OK? But at the moment, these guys have a system of increments that mean that they would have anyway have had this kind of pay rise by the time they get to 2020. So she's got the same 23,000. She goes up to 26,000. So an increase of nearly 13%. OK, another example. We've got a paramedic on just under 30,000. It goes up to nearly 34,000. System of increments would have meant that anyway they get up to 32,000. So really not far off. Now, the government telling people like me all week that this is important. They wanted to reform how these guys were paid. It meant that they needed to have some reform in this package, so there's more money up front. But nonetheless, Jeremy Hunt, these numbers are not quite as generous as they first appeared.
So that's the point which some in the health service have put to me, Jeremy, that you know, made this huge song and dance about these big increases, particularly for those on low pay. But actually, when you compare the new automatic increase with the old automatic increase, it's not much of a difference.
Well, it is actually a significant difference, Robert, but
so explain why this is a much more generous... It's obviously more generous, but explain why it's much more generous.
Well, I wouldn't say... I would say it's more generous. I wouldn't say much more generous. It's a £4.2 billion of extra resources that are going into this deal, which is significant extra money. And let's be clear, that is because we have a Chancellor who has presided over an economy where public finances are now coming under control. And because of that discipline, he is able to make this investment. But it's also in exchange for, and this has always been very clear on his part, some very important productivity changes. So those annual increments that Allegra was talking about...
The automatic progression.
They are the old-fashioned way of doing things, where your pay goes up year in, year out, regardless of your performance. A modern system says we want high-skilled employees who are highly paid, and therefore their pay goes up as their skill levels go up, and we need a proper system of appraisals. And so this deal, which has been accepted by the vast majority of the unions, replaces the current system with a much more modern system. So it's a something-for-something deal.
So, you know, the pay increases on top of the guaranteed ones will be linked to performance reviews. Some would say that will change the culture, the team-working culture of the NHS in a way that could be damaging.
Well, I don't think that's what the unions think. They think actually it's very motivating for staff to think that if I get more skills, if I'm properly appraised, properly trained, then my pay will go up. That's actually what makes people motivated. But there's another aspect to this job, which was the other thing that Allegra touched on, which is that the starting rates of pay for the lowest paid staff will be going up by significantly more than inflation. In fact, the minimum pay you'll get in the NHS will go up by about £2,000. And why is that important? Because with this pressure of an ageing population, we are going to need to massively increase the capacity of the NHS. We're going to need more people working in the NHS and social care system. And to attract people into this profession, those starting rates of pay are very, very important.
Now, if we could just broaden a bit, a lot of controversy this morning over Stephen Parkinson, a Downing Street official, outing one of his former boyfriends, who he said, the former boyfriend, Shamesani, says that that's put some of his family in Pakistan in danger. Should point out that Downing Street's asked us to clarify that this was a statement by him as an official. It was not a statement by a Downing Street spokesman. Slightly implies that Downing Street didn't authorise this statement in the normal way. Do you think Mr. Parkinson's position might be in jeopardy?
Well, I know Stephen Parkinson, and I've always thought of him as someone of the highest integrity. And there are two sides to these stories. But, you know, what I would say is that in terms of the what did or didn't happen in that referendum campaign, it is, you know, properly a matter for the Electoral Commission to look into these things. But I think where the public are is that they want the government to get on and deliver Brexit, and they want us to move on to the next stage in our national destiny. But, I mean, those specific legal matters have to be a matter for the Electoral Commission.
I mean, Vote Leave say that it didn't break the rules, but as you say, the Electoral Commission will ultimately decide. As somebody who was on the other side of the campaign, if it turns out that Vote Leave broke the rules, how would you feel? What should the government do at that point? Well,
I think it's... You know, it has to be something that the Electoral Commission decide. And the critical question here is, you know, first of all, was the campaign properly conducted? But also, did anything that happen that shouldn't have happened, if that was the case, actually affect the result?
How would we know the answer to that? I mean, these hypotheticals are very difficult to answer, aren't they?
You know, this is what happens in every general election. In all parties, there are allegations of misconduct on this side and that side. But I think where the public are is, look, the country made a decision. There was a clear majority to take one course of action. It was the bolder course of action as opposed to the cautious approach that many people favoured. But now, as a government, we have to get on and deliver that. And I think this week
I
will
completely,
give people quite a lot of
completely
hope
agree with
that
you
we can
that
do
lots
that.
of people, I mean, I've just been making a film which will be out on Thursday for ITV, all about how particularly people in the North East feel about Brexit coming up. They voted for Brexit and they want the government to deliver it. But it was a very, very narrow victory for Leave. The allegation of cheating, if it is sustained, will undermine confidence in that outcome, won't it?
Well, I just think it's too early to jump to those kinds of conclusions. And we don't even know in this case whether there has been any impropriety at all. And I don't think we should be speculating. We have, you know, public officials whose job it is to tell us the answer to these things. But I think from the government's point of view, what we have to do is to listen to what the public say. And they say, look, we made a decision. Some of us liked it, some of us didn't. But get on with it now, because we want to move on to the next chapter in our country's history.
Jeremy Hunt, lovely to see you. Thanks for coming in again. And I just want to pick up on some of that with Ben Bradshaw and Heidi Allen. Heidi, very interesting that the Health Secretary is talking about trying to persuade the Cabinet to go for a 10-year settlement for the health service. That felt really quite significant. Would you back that kind of approach?
Absolutely. You know, and I'm one of the MPs who's joined Sarah Wollaston, etc., in asking the Prime Minister to set up some kind of independent royal or otherwise commission.
So this notion of a royal commission, you absolutely back?
Yes, I do, because, you know, every side of politics, as the general public, supports the NHS and wants to make it the best it can be. But inevitably, because it involves taxpayers' money to fund it, it always becomes this political hot potato. So it would take the heat out of it. You know, particularly with the challenges Jeremy mentioned, the number of over 75s we have coming, a 10-year settlement, longer planning has got to be a good thing.
I want to talk to you about this whole issue of privacy and data. But, Ben, I know you wanted to just pick up with what Jeremy Hunt said about health. Has he shot Labour's fox? Because, of course, Labour's, one of the things going for Labour is it seemed to be more trusted on the health service.
Well, let's wait to see what actually happens and what is delivered. But I think it's very interesting that he came on and made these announcements, non-announcement, in the same week that he's written to every hospital trust in the country and basically told them to abandon the 18-week waiting target for surgery and the accident and emergency targets. And that's the reality of the health service after 7 years of the worst funding settlements in the NHS's history. Any extra money for staff, for services, is of course welcome, but that's after 7 years of the worst settlements the NHS has had.
I mean, it's certainly been, as you say, a winter in which the health services resources have been very sorely tested. So, much more to pick up on all of this with both of you, but I know that Allegra just has one or two things she wants to say.
Desperately burning to get this off my chest. Now, look, we know big data is pretty big now, but in the future it's going to be ginormous data. There are around 12 billion devices connected to the internet, monitoring your behaviour, and that's going to rise to 50 billion by 2020. Stupendous numbers that none of us can get our heads round. Let's just go through them. You'll be familiar with most of them. You've got Google taking a note of the digital trail you leave. You've got your supermarket records, be it online or your loyalty card, CCTV watching where you're driving when, how fast, Amazon, the books you buy, even your iPhone health app, all taking note of that digital trail you leave. This is comparatively vanilla stuff. The question is where else it goes in the future. Now, we all know the terrible nightmare scenarios. You've got your bin, your recycling bin, perhaps having a record of what you're recycling when. Your fridge might have a record of when you eat, when you don't eat, when you might be particularly hungry, susceptible to having a chocolate bar sold to you. Then we have your car, taking notes of how fast you're driving, who knows who it shares it with. Apparently, in the future, an HR department could monitor your correspondence, the words you're using, and figure out when you might be on the verge of wanting to quit. Imagine that. And then even children's toys. Some of them could be hooked up to the internet, Wi-Fi enabled, whatever, and keeping a record of their play. These are just some of the many, many, many worries about where big data could go. There's a huge concern about how it's being used, how our lives are being monitored. Many want the government to regulate more to protect our privacy, but there's something of a generational divide about who cares about this stuff, and that is over here. So, breaks down as you might expect. You've got 51% of millennials not bothered or who do care about how companies handle their data, but that does mean quite a large number who are thinking they're a bit worried. It goes down, but again, in the older generation, a third are quite relaxed. So there is a clear picture that younger people are not so worried. But for some of the incredible insights this work on this area, our Geek of the Week is a long-time programme friend and one of the first geeks we ever did business with, Jamie Bartlett from Demos. You are... Here's the badge. Geek.
It's Geek of the Week.
Yes, so he's our Geek of the Week, my favourite moment of the whole programme. Now, if we could get back to what Allegra was just talking about, which is the use or misuse of our data. I'm very struck that this morning the newspapers have almost all got a full-page advert from Facebook apologising for the way that its data was abused, allegedly, by Cambridge Analytica, the controversial political campaigning company. How damaged do you think people's confidence in social media sites like Facebook really is? And do you think that governments should intervene much more to regulate the likes of Facebook?
Well, in terms of what damage, I think huge. I mean, personally, I don't do Facebook, but Facebook is... more, I think, than any other social media platform. It's about family, friends, exchanging life stories. It's ingrained in people's homes. So I think the damage is absolutely huge because it's something people treat very personally. Does the government need to do more? Well, the data protection legislation that's coming through the government will undoubtedly help. And Matt Hancock has been very clear. You do it wrong, you break the rules, and you pay. You know, talk about Facebook fines perhaps over £1 billion.
Ben.
Interesting, these ads are coming out just over a week after Facebook tried to prevent The Observer and Channel 4 News and the New York Times actually printing the truth. I mean, that's the real battle that we're up against. Heidi's absolutely right. I mean, Jeremy just a moment or two said, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it's all the Electoral Commission, the Information Commissioner. These organisations do not have the powers. I mean, look at the farce this week of the Information Commissioner taking nearly a week to get a warrant to get into Cambridge Analytica. There's a great deal more to come out about this, a great deal more to come about the whole vote leave, the Russia stuff, and there's a lot more that will take our attention for the next. But the government's got to act. To pretend it's nothing to do with the government, we need the government's protection against these tech giants.
Now, NHS pay has been in the news this week. It's going up, but is it enough? And does this mean that other public sector workers, like teachers, will get a pay rise too? Well, the Government Health Minister, Steve Bryan, is in Southampton now. Let's ask him. I mean, one of the things you have announced already today is more money for midwives, which is interesting. 3,000 new midwives, I think it is, because you want to make sure that the same midwife follows a mother through the whole of her pregnancy and the birth. Is 3,000 enough?
It's a great start, isn't it? And it's been a great week for the NHS. I mean, on Tuesday we announced these 5 new medical schools. On Wednesday we announced a landmark pay deal. And then today we're announcing a 25% uplift in midwives. So we did the same for doctors. We then did the same for nurses. And now we're doing for midwives. All the research we know, Sarah, says that, you know, we want the NHS to be the safest place in the world to give birth. And all the research suggests that this continuity of care, having the same midwife right the way through, reduces the cases of miscarriage and reduces the case of premature birth.
Absolutely,
so
but the Royal College of Midwives say that the NHS needs 3,500 more midwives just to carry on doing what they're doing, let alone to introduce this policy of the continuity of care that you're talking about. So 3,000 isn't going to cut it, is it?
Well, I think just listen to what the Royal College of Midwives have said. I mean, a pretty effusive welcome for this, and so they should. I think this is a really positive story today. And you know, what we know is that the only reason we're able to do this, the only reason we're able to make the pay announcement this week, which has been rightly, roundly welcomed across the country and across the NHS, is because the economy is recovering. And we know that when the British economy suffers, the NHS catches a cold or worse. And we see in other parts of the world where countries' finances fall apart and they have to borrow to fund their public services. It's the public services that suffer, and then the poorest in society that suffer most. So we're getting the public finances right. That allows us to make the sort of announcements we've made this week, and they should be welcomed.
So
and
basically, you're saying you found the magic money tree.
No, what I'm saying is that we're starting to heal the economy. And look what happens in Portugal, where health spending is diving. Look what happened in Greece, where health spending is diving. What we've found through 8 years of sound management of the economy after the absolute car crash that we inherited is an economy that's healing. And look at the announcement in the spring budget recently, with a record number of people in work. And what that allows us to do is to invest in the public's priorities. And we know that the public's priorities, right at the top of that list, is the NHS.
It was less than a year ago that Theresa May said that she couldn't lift the cap on nurses' pay because there was no magic money tree. Now you're doing that. There are announcements of other further spending in the NHS. It does appear that in less than 12 months, all of a sudden, this tree has sprouted somewhere.
As I say, what it suggests is that the economy is doing really well, and the Prime Minister has, this is not just in the last 12 months, I mean, the Prime Minister and her predecessor David Cameron have really shown their mettle on this, haven't they? We've increased health spending every single year that we've been in office. We gave it just over £2 billion extra in the autumn budget just before Christmas, and then this week we've been able to announce the new medical schools announcement, the pay announcement, and today on midwives. So I think it's it's been a very, very difficult winter for the NHS, but never has a group of people deserved a pay rise more than those that got it announced this week. As far as the other...
Well, let me ask you about the pay rises, because it's interesting to wonder whether or not other public sector workers might expect the same. And before I ask you specifically about that, let's have a listen to what Gavin Barwell, who was an MP who lost his seat in the 2017 election, now obviously the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. This is what he said to Nick Robinson of Panorama shortly after the 2017 election.
There's a conversation I particularly remember with a teacher who had voted for me in 2010 and in 2015 and said, I understood the need for a pay freeze for a few years to deal with the deficit, but you're now asking that to go on potentially for 10 or 11 years, and that's too much. That is something that Jeremy Corbyn was able to tap into.
So do you think the teachers also deserve a pay rise along with the nurses?
Look, what this pay rise shows is that we have to take each individual pay review body recommendation in turn. What this shows is that you can have a recommendation from a pay review body. You can have good and cordial relations with the trade unions, which is why all but one are going to recommend that they accept this pay deal. But what
teachers' pay has fallen in real terms by 15% since 2010. So do they deserve a pay rise?
Look, can I just nail one thing that I just heard there? And Gavin is absolutely right in what he said. But, the difference between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn is Jeremy Corbyn makes it up as he goes along and spends money that the country doesn't have. And that's what landed us. He says he's not New Labour, but he acts like it sometimes, because that's what landed us in these problems in the first place. If you don't have a strong economy, you can't invest in any public services, including the NHS and schools. You can't invest in the pay of the people who make the NHS and make schools and the other public services run. And we have done that over the last 8 years, and we're going to continue doing that, and then we'll be able to invest in the public's priorities.
All right, Steve Brown, thanks very much for joining us.
I've been getting